Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Mem Gimel. This week's learning is sponsored by Ruth and David Kahan in honor of Dr. Jody Duche and Professor Paul Gompers in gratitude for the ongoing and incredibly gracious hospitality. Today's daf is sponsored by Daniel and Sarah Borelowitz on the engagement of their granddaughter Shirel Harrow to Yonatan Banner. Mazal Tov. Okay. A few quick announcements. On second thought of Rabbanit Yafit Clymer is back on. It was a big break for a while, and she's doing a series on kind of background machshava, thought perspectives on korbanot, specifically about blood this week. So you can look on the site; it's up there. The second announcement is our tannaitic challenge is getting a lot of momentum. And if you want to pass it around to people and get more people involved, especially we're also looking to attract young audiences, high school students. It's a great opportunity to kind of get exposed to Gemara and see if it's something that you're interested in continuing, right? The best way, most people are just intimidated by Gemara. So the more we expose people to it, the more women that will join the folds of Gemara learners. So do what you can to encourage others. That's the best really way to publicize Gemara learning. Okay, we're going to get started with our Mishna at the bottom of Mem Bet Amud Bet. Elu dvarim she'ein chayavim alehem mishum pigul. Now, don't get confused by this line. We have to explain what this means. If you remember, what is the chiyuv of pigul? The chiyuv of pigul is not on the one who has the wrong thought. Okay, we could have a korban that's pigul, where someone had a thought, let's say during the slaughtering or whatever part it was that could make it pigul. They had a thought that they're going to eat this or burn it after the time. And yet, when they go to eat a certain part of that offering, talk about right now, or certain of the offerings, there will not be an obligation of karet. Remember how it works. I have to keep repeating this because it's really not what you would intuitively think, which is the pigul of karet, the karet punishment for pigul is when you eat the pigul item, you eat the meat of the sacrifice or the imurim, the parts that are supposed to get burned, you eat them. Okay, after they already became pigul. This Mishna is going to start with, and then we'll get to where there is pigul, but cases in which there's an item that the korban or the offering, whatever it was, became pigul, and yet if you eat it, you're not going to get karet. And not because it's chutz l'mkomo, for example. Remember, only chutz l'zmano you get karet for. Chutz l'mkomo, you will disqualify the korban, but you won't get karet. This is another situation, but here where it's within chutz l'zmano, where normally there is pigul, but if you eat this part, you won't be liable karet. Why? So now we add another factor. Now, I'll just add another one before we even get there. In order for the chiyuv karet to kick in, a few things have to happen. First of all, we learned before that the blood has to be sprinkled, right? Which theoretically, likely it won't be sprinkled. If they realize it's pigul before, it's disqualified. They're not going to bring the blood on the altar, right? So if they don't bring the blood on the altar, you'll never get to chiyuv karet for eating the meat, because unless everything else is done the way it's supposed to be done. And we'll come back to this idea later today. That's why I want to set it up now. Everything has to be done the way it's supposed to be done, other than the pigul thought, right? Remember, if there's another chutz l'mkomo thought, also not, right? It won't be pigul anymore. So also the other parts have to happen, the important parts, right, have to happen. Otherwise, it won't be pigul. But that's not what we're going to focus on now. What we're going to focus on now is, in order for the chiyuv karet to kick in when I eat something, it has to be eating something that that if it was a good korban, if everything had been done properly from A to Z, throughout all the stages, it would be something would permit this to be eaten by the altar or eaten by me. Because remember, that's when pigul kicks in. It's in something that is eaten. It has to be eating something that could have been eaten or burning something that was supposed to be burned, right? Remember, that was the pigul thought was all about that. But the item that I eat has to be something that in a normal process is permitted for consumption by human or by the altar by something else. So what's the classic example? So when I sprinkle the blood, that permits the imurim to be eaten on the altar. Right? The parts that get burned on the altar. If I don't do the sprinkling of the blood, I'm not allowed to put those parts on the altar. That's what's called a matir. One permits the other. Now, I want to differentiate this between let's say shchita, you could say as a matir for the blood, but you can't say that, okay? Now, why would you think to say that? And here I want to get to really, so you understand what the difference is. If I slaughter an animal and then I get the blood and then I sprinkle the blood on the altar. Now, without slaughtering the animal, I can't sprinkle the blood on the altar because I won't have any blood to sprinkle, right? So you'd say, oh, look, that enabled. Now, this is why I didn't use the word enabled, because enabled implies that if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't be able to do that because I physically can't, right? There is no blood to sprinkle without slaughtering. That's not a matir. A matir is a halachic thing. It's where the Torah says you can't burn the imurim until you've sprinkled the blood. Now, theoretically, if I wanted to, I could, right? It doesn't enable it in a physical manner, in a technical manner. Theoretically, I could say, oh, I don't want to sprinkle the blood now. I'm just going to burn the parts on the altar first. So while I could do that, halachically, I can't. So a matir is a halachic enabling and not an actual, in reality, enabling. I want that distinction to be clear because then you'll understand what the difference is. So if there's some stage that has to happen before that stage, from a halachic perspective, there's a particular order, and without doing that, you can't do that. You can't move on. It's like a video game. You can't move on to the next level unless you've done that, right? So then, theoretically, maybe you could, but the game doesn't allow you unless, you follow the rules and you do exactly what you're supposed to do in this level to get to the next level. It's a kind of silly example, but that's what we have here. So if there's nothing that enables you to get to that next stage, then that item that you've gotten to now without any enabler, okay, without the matir, without that, then it's not pigul. So let's start talking about examples and hopefully you'll understand even better. So so this means, again, if I eat it, if let's say at an earlier stage someone had, there was intent, there was a pigul machshava, the korban's disqualified, and I eat this part, I won't get karet, even though theoretically I should, but I won't because there's nothing that's permitting this. There's no matir here for this item. Kometz. What's the kometz? So in a mincha offering, the kohen takes his 3 middle fingers, goes into the dough of the meal offering, right? It's usually made up of oil and water and solet, fine flour, some other things sometimes. He's going to salt, okay? Puts his fingers in, takes out the kometz, okay? That part gets burned on the altar. That's kind of more parallel to shchita and zrika, right? Because there's nothing that permits it to be burned. Well, it's true. If you didn't do the kometz, you didn't take it out, you wouldn't be able to burn it on the altar, but that's not a matir. That's just technically you needed to do that in order to get what a kometz is. So then you burn it on the altar. Now that permits something else, but nothing permitted it to happen. What does it permit? When you burn that, you actually now, once it's burned, the kohen now gets to eat the rest of that dough. Remember, he just took a little piece of the dough to burn on the altar. The rest of the dough, the kohen gets to eat. So the dough that's left, the mincha, that is pigul, because that's what's left for someone to eat, that from the action of the kometz burning on the altar, that permitted the meal offering to be eaten, the rest of it. But the kometz itself that gets burned, nothing enabled that to happen. So that's the kometz. Karet. Okay, the karet gets burnt completely on the altar. There's no stage that has to happen before it. I mean, the karet has to be prepared, the incense, but then you just burn it on the altar. So again, there's no matir. Okay, we're going to use this word matir. That's the enabler. There is nothing that enabled that stage to happen. There's the livona, the frankincense, same thing. Frankincense is much like the kometz. You take a handful of the livona and you burn it on the altar. So it's the same thing. There's no matir. Mincha kohanim, mincha kohen mashiach. Again, in these cases, now these are voluntary offerings a kohen makes, or the kohen gadol who has to bring his mincha every day. We've learned about this. We just learned about it. Those two things get burned completely on the altar. There's no matir at all. You just take the dough and you put it on the altar and burn the whole thing. So there's no pigul if you eat that. Again, what I just want to be clear. What would be pigul here? If when I took it or I put it in the vessel, the holy vessel, or when I did the kmitza, or I took the handful of the livona, I had a thought that I'm going to burn this beyond its designated time, it would be pigul. but I won't be liable karet. So that's why I want you to be clear. You understand it is pigul. It's just you're not going to be liable karet for eating that part because you're only liable for eating a part that has something that enables it in a normal case to be eaten or burned on the altar. And here there is no action that's the enabling action on a halachic perspective. The hadran, the blood that I explained before, right? Well, it's true the shechita lets us have blood to do it, but that's not a matir. There's nothing that permits it all of a sudden to go on the altar. Nisachim habaim b'fnei atzmam. Okay, these are offerings that either I offered to bring libations to the temple, or, okay, which then again get completely burned on the altar or completely poured on the altar like wine libations, or they get offered with a sacrifice. Now, let's say the sacrifice became pigul. Okay, now the idea with nisachim, these libations that go with certain offerings, right? We say it in our davening, min chatam v'nizkehem kemidubar, right? The minachot and the nisachim that go along with it. They theoretically don't have to be brought with the sacrifice. They could be brought on their own. That's what it means you're brought on their own. You can bring it the next day, 2 days later. There's a time frame you're allowed to bring them, but you have actually a few days leverage. So, or leeway is what I meant to say. A few days leeway. So if they're not brought with the sacrifice, then they're not pigul. If the sacrifice becomes pigul, they're not anymore integrally connected because you brought them separately. However, the Rabbi Meir, Divrei Rabbi Meir says in Sachim Habim Ifnei Atzmam, so those they're not pigul. But if they were brought with the animals, if you brought it with the sacrifice, then it could become pigul because it would basically be secondary to the offering. It would have the same rules of the offering. So Rabbi Meir distinguishes between if you brought it a separate day or you brought it together on the same day as the offering. Chachamim omrim afa be'imim be'beimah, even if they come with the animal. They're poured completely. There's no matir to them. In other words, some say, oh, if it comes with the animal, so it's like the sacrificing of the animal enabled this to happen. But the rabbis don't view it that way. Since you could theoretically bring it separately on a different day, so it's not really integrally connected. Log shemen shel mitzora. If you remember the oil, we talked about this recently, the oil of the mitzora. What happens? So first you bring this korban asham, the guilt offering of the leper has to bring. He takes the blood, right? The Kohen puts the blood on the altar, and then the Kohen takes the blood and puts it on the ear, the finger, and the toe, if you remember, of the leper. Then the Kohen takes oil. He sprinkles oil on the altar, and then, on the parochet maybe, forget now, but he sprinkles oil, and then he also puts it on the ear, finger, and toe of the leper. So now there's this debate. Is the blood of the asham, which comes before it, is that an enabler? Does that enable the next stage to happen? Or theoretically, if he did it without it, would that work? So, log shaman shel mitzora, Rabbi Shimon omer ein chayavim alav mishum pigul, because he thinks these are two different actions. One is not dependent on the other. There's no stage that enables the log shaman for the oil sprinklings to happen. Rabbi Meir omer chayavim alav mishum pigul. Rabbi Meir says you are chayav mishum pigul shedam ha'asham mitiro, because he says without doing the blood of the asham, you can't do the oil of the leper. This oil stage. So he thinks they're connected, and then there is a matir, and if there's a matir, an enabler, then there would be pigul if you eat the oil. I guess use it in food. I don't think anybody's drinking the oil. Okay, now the Mishna says, that was all the first category. This is going to be a little bit easier now. Anything that has a matir, whether permits it for the person to be eating or for the altar to be eating, meaning burned on the altar, to permit it to be burned on the altar, you're liable, or to be placed on the altar, right, if it's the oil or the blood, then chayavim mishum pigul, then you'll be liable for pigul. Okay, the truth is it won't really be the blood so much, but the oil, yes. Ha'ola, daman matir et b'sara lemizbech v'ora lekohanim. So the ola, right, the reason it's not blood is because nothing permits the blood ever. Okay, the blood is just what you put on. There's no stage that happens before that permits that to happen. Now, okay, Becky, you're right in the Kohen does smear the oil on the leper's bald head. There is that. That's like the extra oil that's left. Okay, that's not the key elements. Okay, even though it is part of the process, it's not the key. That's what's left on his hand when all the process is done. I didn't mention it because it's not one of the key things, but yes, it is true to mention. Okay, now we get to some examples of a matir. Ha'ola, right? You would have thought it would be a little more intuitive to start off with what is and then get to what is not, but that's not the way the Mishnah worked here. I don't know why. Ha'ola. So in a korban ola, where the burnt offering, all the meat gets burned. Dama matir psara lemizbech ve'ora lekohanim. So the blood permits the meat to be burned on the altar, and the hide to go to the kohanim. It's the only thing that you get to keep of the korban ola, and it goes to the kohanim. It's the hide of the animal. So here's a matir. The blood matirs the meat for the altar, or the hide to the kohanim. Olat ha'of, so the burnt offering of a bird which doesn't have skin. Dama matira pesara lemizbeach. So again, the whole thing gets burnt. So the blood is the enabler that permits the basar, the meat, to go on the altar. Chatat ha'of, sin offering that's a bird. Dama matira pesara lekohanim. So the blood, sprinkling of the blood, permits the meat to be eaten by the kohanim. Palim anisrafim usirim anisrafim. These are the ones that are done in the inner sanctuary that we talked about before. Daman matirat imurehen li karet. When you sprinkle the blood, that permits, because really nothing's going to be burned on the altar except for, right? Because remember, what happens? The animals get burned outside Jerusalem. But the blood permits the imurim, the parts that do get burnt on the altar, the blood permits that to happen. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he disagrees with this last statement. He says there's no pigul in the imurim of the parim and israfim and sirim and israfim, because kol she'eno al mizbeach hachitzon. We actually saw this quoted on Daf Yud Daled. I don't know if you remember, it was a while ago, but we did see this. Anything that's not on the inner altar, kish shlamim, like the shlamim offering, the peace offering, ein chayavim alav mishum pigul. Why is that? There's no pigul at all for the parim, right? For the parim davar shel tzibor, the park Yom Kippurim, all those, this year Yom Kippurim. No, this year of Avodah Zarah, right? All those. There's no pigul at all for them, according to Rabbi Shimon, because the whole pigul was learned about a pasuk about shlamim. Has to be somewhat similar to a peace offering. In what way? That it's burnt, that it's done on the outer altar. And these are not done on the outer altar. The blood goes on the inner altar. So it's different, and therefore there's no pigul. That's the Mishnah. Now we get to this very ambiguous statement of Ula. The Gemara is going to have to try to figure out. It has two parts to it. It's one line and then an explanation of the line. So first what the Gemara is going to do is say that explanation sounds like it's the exact opposite of what it's saying, and what does it possibly mean? And they explain the explanation. And then they go back to the first line and say, what is this first line talking about? And then we're going to ask raise several difficulties. Maybe it means this. We're going to have four possibilities till only on the fourth are we going to actually figure out what it means. And each time we're going to raise a difficulty. Can't be Ula saying it because it says that in a Mishnah. And now Ula's an Amora. An Amora doesn't just make a statement as if he's saying it himself when it appears in a Mishnah. So, okay, there's a lot of complications about this sugya of the Gemara is going to struggle to figure out what are we talking about. So Amar Ula. Ula says the following. Kometz pigul shehe'elo al gabei hamizbeach paka pigulo mimenu. You have a kometz of pigul, like we talked about before. While the Kohen was putting his fingers in to take the kometz, right? He was doing the action of kometz, where you put your three middle fingers into the dough, the dough of this meal offering. You take out the part that's going to be burned on the altar, and you think, I'm going to burn this tomorrow, okay, which you're not allowed to do. Then he takes that piece that's in his hand that he put into the vessel, he brings it to the altar, and he puts it on the altar. Now, you're not supposed to put it on the altar because it's ruined already. You had a pigul machshava, you ruined it. Now, let's just go through again. If he does burn it, what happens? Remember, this is why I started with this today. In order for it to be pigul, what has to happen? So first of all, someone has to eat something, and they have to eat something that was permitted theoretically would have been permitted by something else if it was a normal offering. So the eating, the karet, would happen if he ate not the kometz, because that has no matir to it. If he ate the remainder of the offering, okay, so if somebody eats the remainder of the offering when the offering is pigul, but something else has to happen in order for that to also be karet by eating the remainder, the rest of it has to be brought the way it's supposed to be. So if it was a sacrifice, it would be the blood has to be placed on the altar. If it's a mincha offering, there's no blood. So what has to happen? The kometz has to be burned on the altar. If the kometz isn't burned on the altar, Like let's say they say, oh, disqualified and throw it out of the Beit HaMikdash. Well, then there's no Isur pigul at all. Because unless the rest has been done the way it's supposed to be done and the essential parts, which in this case is burning the kometz on the altar, it wouldn't be pigul. So Ula says the following. If we have a kometz pigul that you put on the mizbeach, now you're not really supposed to put it on the mizbeach because it really is disqualified. But if you put it on the mizbeach, pakat pigulo mimenu. The pigul leaves that kometz. That kometz is no longer a kometz of pigul. We don't know what this means and what we gain from this. We don't really understand this yet. So let's hold off. And here comes the explanation. Im achirim mevi lidei pigul, hu atzmo lo kol shekain. If it brings others to pigul, then shouldn't it also all the more so be pigul? Okay, now that's counterintuitive. That's the opposite of what he said. Didn't he just say the pigul leaves it? Now it sounds like he's saying if this could cause others to become pigul, meaning the remainder becomes pigul by burning it on the altar, then wouldn't you think it all the more so? Sounds like it all the more so should be pigul. So that doesn't make any sense. The Gemara says, my kamar, what on earth was that second sentence? Haki kamar, what it means is this. Im enumerates kabel, he'ach mevi achirim lidei pigul. No, it means like this. If we don't say that this is accepted on the altar, which basically is what Ula said, paka pigul mimenu is as if it doesn't have pigul meaning, the mizbeach can absorb it. It can take it in. Normally you would think you put something disqualified in the mizbeach doesn't want it, right? God doesn't want our mess ups, right? Our wrong, incorrect things. So if you say it's not going to be accepted by the altar, then how can it cause others to become pigul? This goes back to how I started today. Without doing the rest of it the way it's supposed to be done, and this also connects with what we saw yesterday. Remember about the blood? It's like sprinkling water because you already disqualified it. It's like nothing. And then they said, no, right? In a regular case, when you put the blood on the altar, even though you already made the korban pigul during, let's say, the slaughtering, you had a pigul machshava, then you go ahead and you put that blood on the altar, that's considered as if it was done properly. Because otherwise, remember, everything else has to be done properly in order for the meat to become pigul. Likewise here. You have to say that all the other processes were done right. Otherwise, the remainder wouldn't become pigul because pigul there's one pigul machshava, but all the rest of the steps that were essential were taken. So if we say that not paka pigulo, and this is still a pigul piece of meal offering that's sitting on the altar that the altar doesn't want, well, then it's as if it wasn't burned on the altar because the altar doesn't want it. It's kind of rejected by the altar. Then you miss that stage of burning it on the altar, and then the rest of it wouldn't become pigul. So the fact that we know that again, let's go through the stage. If while the Kohen took the kometz, he thought, I'm going to burn this beyond its time. But then he did it, right? He went ahead and burnt it in the right time on that day. That must be an acceptance of the altar of this kometz, because otherwise the shirayim, the remainder of the mincha, would never become pigul, and we know it does. We know that if the kohen now eats, after it was burned on the altar, the kometz, eats the remaining part of the mincha, which is now pigul and disqualified, he's not allowed to eat it. If he eats it, he's going to get karet, or anybody eats it, they're going to get karet. So it must be that stage was accepted by the altar when you burn it. Okay, that's basically what he's saying. So now the question is, wait a minute. So what's Ula teaching us? In other words, we got the second sentence. So now let's put the first one together. Kometz pigul she'ala al gabei mizbeach. So you have a kometz of pigul that you put on the altar. Paka pigulo mimenu. It's as if it's not pigul anymore. Okay, the pigul leaves it because why? How do we know this is the case? Because instead of reading it from there, I'm going to read it from the Hachi Kamar. If it's not accepted by the altar, then it's as if we didn't burn it on the altar. If we didn't burn it on the altar, you'd never get to pigul. How can you say that the remainder is actually pigul? And your chayav karet for eating it has to have been a proper burning. So now they want to know my kamashma. What's Ula really trying to teach us here? And like I said, we're going to have 4 options. And each time we're going to say, oh, but it says that in the Mishna already. It says that in the Mishna already. The third one we're going to say, it says the opposite of that in the Mishna. So it can't possibly be because it goes against the Mishna. As opposed to the first 2, which we're going to say it says exactly that in the Mishna. And then we're going to have the 4th answer, which is really a variation of the third. My kamashon. So what's he coming to teach us? Maybe what he's trying to say is, it says in our Mishnah, which is paka pigulomi menu, meaning, well, if you eat that kometz, let's say I put it on the altar and then I immediately take it down and I decide to eat it. If you eat it, paka pigulomi menu, it's not pigul anymore, and you're not liable for eating it because there's no pigul. Well, Tanina, that already we know in the Mishnah. You're never liable for the kometz because what did we say? Right? There's no matir for the kometz. That part doesn't have an enabling action. So Tanina, it says it already in our Mishnah. Elu dvarim. Now you know why they brought the statement of Ula here, because the first attempt to explain it, what he really means here, is our Mishnah. Elu dvarim she'en chayvim alehem mishum pigul hakometz v'aktoreh v'alevonam v'chakonim v'chakoy mashiach v'mechan nesachim v'adam. Okay, they didn't need to read all that. They just need to read the first one. The kometz doesn't have pigul if you eat it, so it's irrelevant, right? Ula doesn't need to tell us that if it says it in the Mishnah. Okay, option 2. Ela de'im alu lo yirdu. Maybe what he's trying to tell us is, we learned this before, that there's some things that are so disqualified that if you put them on the altar, you must immediately take them down. But there's many other things, more so than in the other category, that if you put them on the altar, you shouldn't. But if you do, like this, you shouldn't put it on because the korban's already pigul and disqualified. But if you put it on, you don't need to take it off. And this, some of the commentators call this, it becomes lachmei hamizbeach. It becomes like the bread of the altar. The altar kind of takes it in and says, okay, this wasn't great, you shouldn't have done it, but now that it's here already, it's mine, and we can burn it. That actually sounds like what Ula is saying, because pigul she'lo al gabei hamizbeach, you put the pigul on the mizbeach, which you shouldn't have, you did it anyway, paka pigulo mimenu, it can stay on the altar because the fact that it's on the altar now kind of removes the pigul from it. Remember, it doesn't remove pigul from the whole sacrifice, the whole offering. In this case, it's not sacrifice, it's an offering. Because if you go ahead and eat the remainder of the meal offering, there will be pigul. What it's saying is this piece that's now on the altar, well, gets absorbed by the altar and it's not a problem. You can leave it there. But that also, Tanina, that also appears in the Mishnah. Halan v'hayotze v'atamei. These are all things that if you put them on the altar, you don't have to take them down. If it was left overnight, and then you shouldn't put it on the altar anymore, but you did anyway. Or it left the Azarah boundaries, the boundaries of the Azarah, which it shouldn't have, or it was tamei, or it was impure. Vishenishchat chutz lizmano v'chutz l'mkomo, or was slaughtered with a machshava pigul, either outside the time or outside the space. Now notice it doesn't say machshava, but we learned already, if it says nishchat chutz l'mkomo chutz lizmano, you can't say it was slaughtered outside its time. There is no time until you start slaughtering. The slaughtering is what sets the clock. From then, it has to be done that day. But before you slaughter it, it can be done any day. There is no slaughtering chutzes mano in kazedavar. There's no such thing. So it obviously means it was slaughtered with a pigul machshava, which is our case. And then it says imalu lo yirdu. Okay, if you put them on the altar, you don't take them off. Okay, so it can't be that. Next option. Ela de'im yirdu ya'alu. Maybe it means like this. If you put on the altar, which you shouldn't have, you don't take it off because it's already absorbed by the altar. But what if it then fell off? Maybe what it wants to tell you, im yardu ya'alu. Once it's on the altar accepts it. So even if it falls off, you put it back on. Maybe that's what it's coming to tell you. The paka it's really not pigul anymore. So you can put it back on the altar, even if it fell. Well, this is the one that says, the Mishnah says the opposite. Hanami tanina. It also appears in the Mishnah. Kishem she'im alu lo yardu. Just like if they went up, they don't come down. Kach im yardu lo ya'alu. In other words, leave this where it is. If it went up, you leave it up. If it fell down, you leave it off. So the Mishnah says the opposite, so it can't be Ula saying that. So fourth explanation, if already it started burning at the top of the altar and the fire started consuming it, really consuming it, then if it falls off, you can put it back on. Then it's already at a later stage. That's what he's saying. That one's going to be okay, except for one smaller problem. Nami Amar Ula Chadazimna. Ula himself said that some other time. So Ula doesn't need to repeat what he says. The Amar Ula said, Lo shanu ela shalom mashla b'hena or, aval mashla b'hena or ya'alu. So he says, if you have this pigul or whatever these things are, and you put them back on, and you put them on the altar anyway, and the fire consumes them and they fall off, you can put them back on. So why would he repeat it? Well, there he was talking about animals, and therefore you might have thought to distinguish. And here's going to be the answer. Ma'u detema, you might have thought, turning out on a bet, hanimile aver. That's if it's a limb of an animal, demechabel, because a limb of an animal is one unit. Whereas a mincha offering of a kometz, demifrat, emalo. Think about a meal offering. It's like a piece of matzah, okay? That piece of matzah is made up of different parts of it that don't really connect to each other. It's not a limb that in the animal it all functioned as one thing. No, they're all separate particles, you could say. So maybe if the fire consumes one part of it, it does, and then it falls off, maybe you can't put the whole thing back on. You only put the part that was consumed by the fire. So the fact that he says it by an animal part doesn't necessarily mean he would say the same thing by a meal offering, and that's why he needed to repeat it. Comes Rabachai and takes this one step farther. Amar Rabachai, hilkachai kometz pigul de palge. What if he says, I'm going to take this one step farther. If you have a piece of the kometz, of the meal offering, that broke, okay, imagine, right? It falls off the altar. Likely you have matzah, it's going to break. Machada'ara upalge aske amaracha. In other words, part fell on the floor, and part was burned on the altar, burning still. Okay, umashlabo or right. So it's split in half. One part is on the floor, one part is being burned at the top of the altar, and the fire is consuming it. You can even forget about the part when it's together that maybe you view it as two different parts. He takes it even farther. Even if they're, and we don't, we view it as one part. Even when they separate, we still view that kometz, that piece the Kohen took off, as one unit. So if part of it fell off and the fire's burning the other part, and that's the part that's consumed, we could even put the bottom part up. If nothing was consumed on the altar, we can't put it back up. But if part of it was consumed, we actually can bring the whole thing back, even if it's not even together physically anymore. Okay, so that was a very long explanation of what ulistema was. Pigul mimenu really means don't put it on the altar, but if you put it on the altar, and even if it fell, as long as it started being consumed by fire before, you can put it back on the altar because pigul mimenu, the pigul leaves it. It's no longer considered pigul, right? Because if we still considered it pigul, we wouldn't be able to. Now, again, the rest of the offering is still pigul. It doesn't remove pigul from the whole offering, just removes pigul from this kometz, this piece. Okay. Now, in the same vein, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he just expands this a little farther. We're going to have an issue with one of his expansions. Hapigul, which is our case, and he's going to say the same thing as ula. Hanotar, meat that was remaining beyond its designated time. Vehatame, and impure meat. Now, none of these can be offered on the altar. But if you put them on the altar, the isser leaves them. So Amar Rav Chisda, Mari Dechi, author of the statement, like Rabbi Yochanan, Mizbeach mikvah tahara. How can the Mizbeach remove impurity? What, it's a mikvah, the Mizbeach? It's not a mikvah. Amar Rabbi Zera, Shemashla behena ol. Rabbi Zera says it's when it's consumed by fire. If it's consumed by fire, the fire kind of burns the impurity off. So Mativ Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Bisna. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Bisna says, how could you say that? Achirim omrim. Now he's going to quote him a part of a much longer braita that we're going to see the whole braita in a minute. The fourth drasha in this braita. We're going to have four drashot to say the same thing, but in different ways, to learn the same halacha, I should say, in different ways. There's a pasuk in Vayikra chapter 7, verse 20. It says, Hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim asher lashem. Actually, I should read you 19 first. Okay, 19 says, Habasar asher yiga b'chol tameh, subject being the meat that touches impurity, sacrificial meat that becomes impure. Lo yachel, don't eat it. By eish yisaref, it has to be burned. V'habasar, now when it comes to meat, kol tahor yochal basar. Only pure people can eat meat. So it started with meat that's impure and moved to a person who's impure. Now comes the next pasuk, which you'd think was talking about a person who's impure, but it's not clear really, because it starts like this. Hanefesh asher tochal mi basar zevach hashlamim. So a person who eats from the sacrificial meats, asher la'Hashem, that belong to God, v'tuma to'alav, and the tuma is upon him. Now him could be referring to the person. Him could be referring to the meat, because the previous pasuk talked about both cases. It's not clear. So either the tuma is on the meat or the tuma is on the person. You get karet. So who's this talking about? The person or the meat? If the meat is impure or the person's impure. So one of the explanations, there's four explanations how we know it's the person. And the fourth one is this. Achirim, we're bringing this to show that the you can't say that the impurity comes off the meat by burning it. Why? Well, it says v'tuma to'alav. What are they darshan? And the tumah is upon him. Misha tumah porachat mimenu. It has to be the tumah is upon him, but can go off of him, right? Tumah alav means right now the tumah is on him, but theoretically could come off. Now, what would that mean? Misha tuma paracha mimenu. That's a person or something that the tuma can leave. Yatsa basar, excluded from this is the meat. It must be the person, because a person can become pure again, but right, go to a mikvah. But meat, she'ein tuma paracha mimenu. You can't. If meat becomes disqualified, there's nothing you could do. You can't get the impurity off. Vim ita. And if he was right, what the way Rabbi Zera said, once the meat is burned, the impurity leaves the meat. Hare tuma paracha mimenu al yedea, or you see that you can get rid of tuma and meat. So it wouldn't be excluded from that pasuk. So Amarava, we're going to have three answers to this difficulty. Al yedei mikvah kamrin. And we were saying that tuma doesn't come off of it by going in a mikvah. Now the sacrificial meat will not become pure because you stuck it in a mikvah. So the Gemara says, midi mikvah k'tiv. Okay, they don't like that answer because it doesn't say tumato will be removed from him by a mikvah. It says in any way. So that doesn't work. Ela Amarav Papa, second explanation. B'visar shlamim askina de lo chaze lahakrava. If you notice in that pasuk it said shlamim. It was talking about meat. Now there the meat doesn't get burned on the altar. So in shlamim, the meat can never become pure because the meat never gets burned on the altar. The people eat the meat. So that's why there's no possibility. But theoretically, if it was meat that was burned on the altar, the meat could come off. The tuma could come off. Ravina, our third answer, v'tumato alav, misha tuma paracha mimenu kishu shalem. What they meant, now if I'm impure, I go to the mikvah, I become pure. I'm the same person I was before. I don't look any different. Nothing happened to my body. I didn't cut off a part of my body when I did it. But if you burn the meat on the altar, the meat is not the same meat as it was before. Some of it's burnt, some of it's not there anymore. It's missing some part of it. So what they meant in this braita was the tumah doesn't get removed from it and it remains intact. Maybe it won't remain intact and the tumah could be removed, but that's not what they're talking about. Talking about tumah doesn't get removed in a way that it could actually remain intact. Okay, now we're going to go into gufa, into this braita. So this is basically an extension. Yitzchak said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, not just pigul, also no turn tamei. We said, how could tamei? And they said, well, by fire. And then they said, wait, in this braita it says tumah doesn't come off of meat. How do you explain that? And we have three explanations. One we rejected, but two were accepted. Okay, gufa. Now we're going to go into this braita. B'tumato alav. So the braita starts off quoting this pasuk. It says, "B'tumata gufa k'tumah daber." They're talking about tumah of a person, not the tumah of the meat. To which the braita then says in a classic midrash halacha style, "Are you sure? Maybe it's really the meat being impure. You get karet for eating meat that became tamei." Well, first explanation. We're going to have four drashot on this pasuk. Ne'amar kan tumato, v'ne'amar lalan tumato. They're going to compare two words that appear in two different places. Zereshava. The word tumato appears in our pasuk, tumato alav, and tumato appears in someone who goes into the mikdash when they're tamei. Now, in the case of biat mikdash, it's the person that's tamei, not the mikdash. So ma lahalam b'tumata gufa k'tum medaber, ach kan b'tumata gufa k'tum medaber. Just like there, it's a person. Here, it's a person. Rabbi Yossi Omer. And again, the impurity is on the person. Ho'il v'demru kodashim b'lashon rabim, v'nemra tuma b'lashon yachid, b'tumata gufa k'tum medaber. He's going to use a grammatical explanation. It says the zevach shlamav, shlamim in plural. Okay, so it says zevach shlamim. Zevach hashlamim, shlamim is plural. And then it moves to the tumato is on him, singular. On him must be the person who's impure and not the multiple. If it was tumato alehem, it should have said, if it was talking about the shlamim. So that's his grammatical explanation. Rabbi Amar ve'achal, b'tumata guf k'tum medaber, it says, and he eats, therefore it must be tumata guf. Okay, we don't understand this one. We're going to come back to this. Not very clear how he means this. Fourth, because it could be he eats the impure meat, right? It's not clear that means, so we're going to get back to that. 4. Achirim omrim, this we saw already. Tumato ala, mish tuma parachat mimenu, yatsa basar she'im tuma parachat mimenu, and there we have, right? It's only something that tuma could be removed from, and that's a human, not meat. Okay, now we get to this third one that we didn't understand. Amar mar. Rebbe Omer, ve'achal b'tumata gufa k'tum medaber. So ve'achal comes teacher tumata guf. My mashma, how do you get it from there? Unclear. So Amar Rava gives an introductory remark. Kol kra de lo mefarish le Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, v'chomat nita de lo mefarish le Ze'eri, lo mefarisha. If your pasuk is not explained by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, or your braita is not explained by Ze'eri, don't bother explaining it. In other words, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi is brilliant. Look how he explained this pasuk. In other words, he explained to us something no one else could figure out. And Ze'eri explained to us some braita that no one else could figure out. So Hachi Amar of Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Now, Ze'eri's thing has nothing to do with anything here. It's just another statement, okay, that was just, he lumped these two together because they were things that people couldn't understand, came these rabbis and made sense out of it. So this is what he said. הואיל ופתח הכתוב בלשון נקבה, וסיים בלשון נקבה, ולשון זכר באמצע, בטומאת הגוף הכתוב מדבר. Okay, he says something that's also not so clear, but with help of the commentaries, this is what he means. So our pasuk, I want you to notice, okay, it starts with hanefesh asher tochal. Tochal is feminine. Then it says ve'achal, that's why he quotes the ve'achal. Okay, hanefesh asher tochal asher la'Hashem, sorry, v'tumato alav. It doesn't say ve'achal in our pasuk, by the way, at all. I just want to point out. Then it says alav, which is masculine, and then it says v'nichrita nefesh hahi me'ameha, nichrita nefesh hahi is feminine. So we do feminine, masculine, feminine. Now, if you didn't have the next pasuk, where we're going to see why the next pasuk helps you, you would have thought, where's the masculine in tumato alav? If it was talking about feminine, which sounds like a woman who this happened to, why they would use feminine language is a good question. They use feminine language, and then it switches to masculine. It must be talking about two different things. The feminine is the person, and the alav is the meat. And then you would think it's tumat, the meat, and not tumat, the person. But if you go to the next pasuk, it does the exact same thing, and there's no way to explain it. It's talking about the meat. The masculine in the middle of the two feminines, which is the word v'achal, is clearly the same person. So that's going to build a paradigm for our pasuk that the middle one is the person also, the same person as before. That's basically the way it's going to work. So nefesh kitiga, this is the next pasuk. A person who touches, b'chol tamei, b'tumat adam, here it's clear the person became tamei. O b'beimat me'al b'chol sheketz tamei, ve'achal mibasar zevach hashlamim asher l'Hashem, ve'nichrita nefesh hi me'ameh. So there's feminine tiga, nichrita nefesh hi at the end, feminine, and achal in the middle. That's going to build the paradigm for our pasuk, and that's how he explains that complicated thing. Now we're going to go to Ze'eri. Okay, now, did Matnita, what's this Braita that Ze'eri helped us? And for this, I'm going to share my screen for a quick minute. We're kind of at the end, and we'll only really get started on this. But here I use the sheet to help. Im ne'emru kalot, lama ne'emru chamurot. Ve'im ne'emru chamurot, lama ne'emru kalot. Okay, now we don't know what these kalot or chamurot are, but if light halacha were written, then why do you need the severe ones? And if the severe ones were written, the stringent ones, why do you need the light ones? So now they say, if we had the light ones and not the stringent ones, hayiti omer, I would have said, ala kalot belav, it's a low say only, you get lashes, ala chamurot b'mitan, I would have thought that the stringent ones, if they weren't mentioned, have a more stringent halacha, you get death. Lachein de'emar chamurot. That's why you needed to know that the chamurot also only get lashes. Now, if it said the stringent ones and it didn't say the light ones, I would have thought the chamurot, you're liable lashes. But the light ones, maybe you're exempt completely. That's why it says kalot. So we need both to be mentioned because you would have come to mistaken conclusions. So we're just going to start the first one today. My kalot and my chamurot, the first possibility. Okay, if the kalot are ma'aser, okay, and that you ate them, right? You ate them when you were impure, or truma. Okay, I would have thought. So now let's try it. If you say the kalot or maaser and the chamurot or truma, what would I have said? Hayiti omer ala chamurot yehe chayav, ala kalot yehe patur. Sorry, I read the wrong line. Hayiti omer. Okay, so sorry. Let's just read it again. Ilem kalot maaser chamurot truma. Hayiti omer b'mita. Okay, now it says, I would have thought you get mavet for truma, right? If it had said maaser and not truma, I would have thought you get death for truma. But actually, you do get death for truma. Hashtanami habimita. You do get death by the hands of God for truma. So it can't be that because this was saying the chamurot, you actually get a lotase. V'lo ne'emru hayiti omer b'mita. Now, if it hadn't said it, then I would have said you get mita. No way. If it said kalot belav and it didn't say anything for chamurot, why would you have thought you get death for them? Dayo lavo min adin liot kanidon. We say, right? Sorry, dayo lava min adin liot kanidon. If you're going to learn one thing from the other, you can never learn it that it's more severe. You can always just learn that it's the same. So you wouldn't have gotten to the conclusion that chamurot get mita. So it can't be that. And we're going to go back tomorrow and we'll continue from here and figure out what it's actually talking about. So what we did today is we started with the things that there's pigul when you eat them, and or we really start with the ones there isn't pigul when you eat them because there's nothing that's a matir, a permitter, enabler of that stage to happen. There has to be an enabler, halachic enabler, to let that stage happen in order for that item to become pigul when you eat it. So be chayiv karet. Again, the korban can be pigul, but the object is not pigul for eating it. And we had the list of items. Then we had the list of items that are pigul because there is an enabler. And so if you eat it, you'll get karet. We had Ulo, who made this very ambiguous statement that we eventually figured out. Put pigul on the altar, the pigul leaves it, meaning if you put it on, you leave it on. And even if it falls off once the fire consumed it, you actually can put it back on. Okay. And after we went through all the back and forths there, we had an extension of that, even if it breaks. And the broken part is the part that's off the altar, right? The part that fell, it doesn't even have the fire on it, but we view this as one unit. And then we got to Rabbi Yochanan, who extended this even to notar and tameh. And we said, how could you say tameh? Doesn't really seem to go with this braita. We resolved that in a few different ways, and then we got into that braita, and then we got into this one line we didn't understand. We got into Yitzchak Bar Dumi's explanation because Rava introduced that together with Se'eri. We got to this confusing statement of Se'eri, which we'll start with tomorrow. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.